July 1st, 1839. The Caribbean Sea. A Spanish schooner called La Amistad cuts through the dark waters off the coast of Cuba, carrying a cargo that its crew believes is safely secured below deck. 53 African captives being transported to a life of slavery. But on this night, everything will change. A young man named Sengbe Pieh, who the Spanish have renamed Joseph Cinqué, has managed to free himself from his chains. Within hours, he and his fellow captives will take control of the ship in one of history's most famous slave rebellions. But their struggle for freedom is just beginning. What follows will be a 2-year legal and political battle that will captivate the nation, reach the Supreme Court, and help accelerate America's march towards civil war. This is the story of the Amistad Rebellion. Our story begins not in the Caribbean, but on the west coast of Africa, in what is now Sierra Leone. Sengbe Pieh was born around 1814 in the village of Mani, part of the Men people. He was not born into slavery, but lived as a free man, a rice farmer with a wife and 3 children. His life was ordinary, peaceful, and secure. He had no reason to believe that everything he knew would soon be torn away from him. But in early 1839, Sengbe's life changed forever. While traveling on a road away from his village, he was kidnapped by African slave traders. This was a common practice along the West African coast, where rival ethnic groups and opportunistic raiders would capture people to sell to European and American slave traders. The Atlantic slave trade had been officially outlawed by both Britain and the United States decades earlier, in 1807 and 1808 respectively. But the illegal trade continued, driven by enormous profits and the insatiable demand for enslaved labor in the Americas. Sengbe was marched to the coast, a journey of brutal hardship. He was chained to other captives, forced to walk for days with little food or water. Those who couldn't keep up were often killed and left by the roadside. When they reached the coast, Sengbe was held in a barracoon, a slave fortress near present-day Freetown, Sierra Leone. Here, he was branded, examined like livestock, and prepared for the horrific journey across the Atlantic. The Middle Passage, as this transatlantic voyage was known, was one of the most brutal experiences in human history. Millions of Africans were forced onto slave ships, packed into spaces so tight they could barely move, chained in the darkness below deck for weeks or months. Disease was rampant. Many died from dysentery, smallpox, or simply from despair. The dead were thrown overboard. The survivors arrived traumatized, weakened, and forever changed by the experience. Sengbe and approximately 500 other captives were loaded onto the Portuguese slave ship Tequera in April 1839. The ship set sail for Cuba, a Spanish colony where slavery remained legal and profitable. The voyage took about 2 months, and conditions were nightmarish. The captives were packed so tightly they could barely breathe. They were given minimal food and water. Many became sick, and dozens died during the crossing. Sengbe survived, but he arrived in Havana, Cuba, a changed man, filled with rage and a desperate desire for freedom. In Havana, the Tequera's cargo of enslaved Africans was illegal. Spain had signed treaties with Britain agreeing to end the slave trade, though slavery itself remained legal in Spanish colonies. To get around these restrictions, newly arrived Africans were given Spanish names and fraudulent documents claiming they were Ladinos, enslaved people who had been in Cuba for years and were therefore legally held. This paperwork was a fiction, but it was accepted by corrupt officials who profited from the illegal trade. Sengbe and 52 other Africans, including 4 children, were purchased by 2 Spanish plantation owners, Jose Ruiz and Pedro Montes. Ruiz and Montes planned to transport their newly purchased slaves to plantations on another part of Cuba. They chartered a ship for the journey, a sleek 2-masted schooner called La Amistad, which means friendship in Spanish. The name would prove bitterly ironic. La Amistad set sail from Havana on June 28, 1839, with a crew of 4+ Ruiz and Montes. The captives were chained below deck, while the ship's captain, Ramon Ferrer, navigated the vessel along Cuba's northern coast. The voyage was supposed to take 3 or 4 days, an easy coastal trip. But the Africans on board had other plans. Sengbe Pieh, who the Spanish called Joseph Cinqué, emerged as a leader among the captives. Despite the language barriers, different African groups on the ship found ways to communicate. Sengbe was intelligent, charismatic, and determined. He had already survived kidnapping, the Barracoon, and the Middle Passage. He was not going to accept a life of slavery without a fight. The captives were terrified of what awaited them. The ship's cook, Celestino, had cruelly told them through gestures that they would be killed and eaten when they reached their destination. While this was meant as a dark joke, the Africans, who didn't speak Spanish and had no way of knowing what was true, believed it. They thought they were being transported to their deaths. On the night of July 1st, during a storm, Sengbe managed to free himself from his chains using a loose nail he had found. He quietly freed the other captives. They found sugarcane knives stored on the ship, long machetes used for harvesting cane. Armed with these weapons and driven by desperation, the Africans rose up. The rebellion was swift and violent. The Africans stormed the deck, taking the crew completely by surprise. Captain Ferrer grabbed a weapon and tried to fight back, but he was quickly overwhelmed and killed. The ship's cook, Celestino, who had terrorized the captives with his cruel jokes, was also killed. 2 crew members escaped by jumping overboard and swimming to shore. Ruiz and Montez fought, but were spared when they surrendered. Within minutes, the Africans controlled the ship. They had won their freedom through force. But now they faced a crucial problem. None of them knew how to navigate a ship across the ocean back to Africa. They needed the Spanish crew members alive to sail the ship home. Sengbe, through gestures and broken communication, ordered Montez to sail the ship east, toward the rising sun, toward Africa. Montez agreed, but he had no intention of honoring this command. During the day, when the Africans could see the sun, Montez sailed east as ordered. But at night, he secretly changed course, sailing north and west, hoping to reach the southern United States where slavery was legal and where he and Ruiz might be rescued. This deception continued for nearly 2 months. La Amistad zigzagged across the Atlantic, sailing east by day and northwest by night. The Africans didn't know how to navigate by the stars, so they couldn't detect the trick. Supplies ran low. Several of the Africans died from dehydration and disease. The ship became a floating prison of confusion and desperation, with the Africans in control but unable to reach their destination. During this time, La Amistad was occasionally spotted by other ships. The sight of black men on the deck of a Spanish schooner raised suspicions, but the ship always managed to avoid being boarded. On a few occasions, the Africans went ashore on Long Island to trade for supplies, using Spanish gold doubloons they had found on the ship. These encounters with Americans created confusion and fear. Who were these Africans? Were they escaped slaves? Pirates? Something else entirely? On August 26, 1839, nearly 2 months after the rebellion, La Amistad was spotted off the coast of Long Island, New York by the USS Washington, a U.S. Navy brig. Lieutenant Thomas Gedney commanded the Washington, and he ordered his crew to investigate the strange vessel. When they boarded La Amistad, they found an extraordinary scene: emaciated Africans in tattered clothing, a ship in disarray, and 2 Spaniards who immediately claimed they had been kidnapped by African pirates. Gedney seized the ship and arrested everyone on board. The Africans were taken into custody, not as free people who had justly rebelled against their kidnappers, but as suspected criminals. They were transported to New Haven, Connecticut, and imprisoned while authorities tried to figure out what to do with them. Ruiz and Montez immediately filed claims for their property, the Africans and the ship's cargo, demanding they be returned. The Amistad case quickly became a national sensation. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the African mutineers and their dramatic journey. Abolitionists saw the case as an opportunity to strike a blow against slavery. Pro-slavery forces saw it as a test of property rights. The Spanish government demanded the return of the ship and the Africans, claiming they were Spanish property. The Africans were held in the New Haven jail, where they became objects of intense curiosity. Thousands of people came to see them, paying admission to gawk at the exotic prisoners. But the Africans also attracted the attention of abolitionists who wanted to help them. A group formed calling themselves the Amistad Committee, led by Louis Tappan, a wealthy New York merchant and committed abolitionist. The Amistad Committee faced an enormous challenge. The Africans spoke no English, and no one in Connecticut spoke Mende or any of the other West African languages represented among the captives. Communication was nearly impossible. How could the Africans tell their story if no one could understand them? The committee searched the docks of New York until they found James Covey, a British sailor who had been born in Sierra Leone and spoke Mende. Finally, Sengbe and the others could tell their story. They explained that they were not Cuban slaves, but free people who had been kidnapped from Africa. They described the Middle Passage, the illegal sale in Havana, and the rebellion on the ship. Their testimony was powerful and compelling. The legal battle over the Amistad captives was complex, involving multiple competing claims. The Spanish government demanded the return of the ship and the Africans under treaty obligations. Ruiz and Montez claimed the Africans as their legal property and demanded compensation. Lieutenant Gedney claimed salvage rights to the ship and its cargo, including the Africans. And the Africans themselves, through their lawyers, claimed they were free people who had been illegally enslaved. The case went to trial in federal district court in Connecticut in January 1840. The Africans were represented by Roger Sherman Baldwin, a prominent lawyer and abolitionist. The trial centered on a crucial question. Were the Africans legal property under Spanish law, or were they free people who had been illegally enslaved? The defense argued that the Africans had been kidnapped in violation of Spanish law, which prohibited the importation of new slaves from Africa. The fraudulent documents claiming they were Ladinos were proof of the illegal nature of their enslavement. Therefore, they had every right to fight for their freedom, and their rebellion was an act of self-defense, not piracy or murder. The prosecution argued that the court should accept the Spanish documents at face value and return the Africans as property. They claimed that what happened on the ship was mutiny and murder, regardless of how the Africans had come to be there. During the trial, Sengbe Pieh became a central figure. Though he couldn't speak English, his presence in the courtroom was commanding. Observers described him as dignified, intelligent, and charismatic. At one point, he gave a dramatic speech in Mende that, even though most people couldn't understand the words, conveyed his passion and his demand for justice. In January 1840, Judge Andrew Judson ruled in favor of the Africans. He determined that they had been illegally enslaved and therefore had the right to use force to escape. He ordered that they be freed and returned to Africa. It was a stunning victory for the abolitionists and for the Africans themselves. But the case was far from over. The U.S. government, under President Martin Van Buren, appealed the decision. Van Buren, a Northern Democrat who relied on Southern political support, wanted to maintain good relations with Spain and was sympathetic to the property rights arguments of slaveholders. His administration pushed for the Africans to be returned to Cuba and slavery. The case went to the U.S. Circuit Court, which upheld Judge Judson's decision. Still, the government appealed, bringing the case to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Amistad case would now be decided by the highest court in the land. The abolitionists knew they needed the best legal representation possible for this final battle. They recruited former President John Quincy Adams, who was then serving in the House of Representatives. Adams was 73 years old and had argued before the Supreme Court many times during his long career. Though he hadn't practiced law in decades, he agreed to take the case because he believed deeply in the cause. The Supreme Court heard arguments in the Amistad case in February and March 1841. The government's case was presented by Attorney General Henry Gilpin, who argued that the court should defer to the executive branch on matters of foreign relations and should honor Spanish treaty claims. Adams argued for 8.5 hours over 2 days, delivering one of the most memorable speeches in Supreme Court history. He appealed to the justices' sense of natural law and human rights. He pointed out the absurdity of treating kidnapped free people as legal property. He invoked the Declaration of Independence and its assertion that all men are created equal with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Adams also addressed the political pressure the court was facing. He reminded the justices that they had a duty to administer justice regardless of political considerations. In what became one of the most famous passages of his argument, Adams pointed to a copy of the Declaration of Independence hanging in the courtroom and declared that the principles of that document applied to all people, regardless of their color. On March 9, 1841, the Supreme Court issued its decision. In a 7-1 ruling, the court affirmed the lower court decisions. Justice Joseph Story, writing for the majority, determined that the Africans had been illegally enslaved and therefore had the right to resist. The court ordered them freed and authorized their return to Africa. The decision was a landmark victory. The Africans had won their freedom through the American legal system, but the victory was also limited. The court's decision applied only to these specific individuals. It did not challenge the legality of slavery itself in the United States. Southern slavery remained intact, and the court made clear that its decision should not be interpreted as an attack on property rights in general. Nevertheless, the decision was celebrated by abolitionists as a major triumph. The Amistad Africans became symbols of the fight against slavery, living proof that enslaved people were human beings deserving of rights and justice. But the legal victory didn't mean the Africans could immediately go home. They had no money and no way to arrange passage to Africa. They remained in Connecticut while the Amistad Committee raised funds for their journey home. During this time, the Africans lived in Farmington, Connecticut, in a community that welcomed them. They learned English, and some converted to Christianity. They also toured New England, giving presentations to raise money for their voyage home. Tragically, not all of the Amistad Africans lived to see their homeland again. Several died while waiting in Connecticut, including one of the children. But in November 1841, 35 survivors, along with several missionaries, boarded a ship for Sierra Leone. After more than 2 years away from home, they were finally going back to Africa. Sengbe Pieh returned to his village to discover that his wife and children had disappeared, likely captured in slave raids during his absence. The tragedy of his personal loss was compounded by the realization that the slave trade continued despite his own escape. He tried to rebuild his life, working with the missionaries who had accompanied him from America. But his later years were difficult, marked by the trauma of everything he had experienced. The legacy of the Amistad case extended far beyond the fate of the individuals involved. The case energized the abolitionist movement at a crucial time. It provided a moral victory and demonstrated that the legal system could, at least sometimes, recognize the humanity and rights of Black people. The case also educated many Americans about the realities of the slave trade. The testimony and evidence presented during the trials revealed the brutal details of the Middle Passage and the illegal nature of much of the slave trade. Many people who had been indifferent to slavery were moved by the stories of Sengbe and his companions. For the abolitionist movement, the Amistad case provided powerful arguments and inspiring examples. The image of Sengbe Pieh, standing in chains but unbowed, demanding his freedom, became iconic. Abolitionist publications featured his story and his image. He became proof that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents fighting for their freedom. The case also highlighted tensions within American society over slavery. The fact that the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, that presidents and diplomats were involved, and that it generated intense national debate, showed how divisive the issue had become. The Amistad case was one of many incidents in the 1830s and 1840s that demonstrated the impossibility of compromising on slavery. The involvement of John Quincy Adams was particularly significant. Adams was not a radical abolitionist, but his passionate advocacy for the Africans showed how the slavery issue was pushing moderate Northerners toward more anti-slavery positions. His argument before the Supreme Court, with its appeals to natural rights and the Declaration of Independence, provided a framework that later abolitionists would use in their arguments against slavery itself. The Amistad case also revealed the international dimensions of slavery. The involvement of Spanish officials, the British Anti-Slavery Patrol, and the complex web of illegal slave trading showed that slavery was not just an American problem, but a global system of oppression. The case demonstrated how difficult it was to enforce bans on the slave trade when enormous profits were at stake. For African Americans, both free and enslaved, the Amistad case was inspiring but also bittersweet. It was inspiring because it showed that Black people could win in court, that they could be recognized as human beings with rights. The fact that Sengbe and his companions were freed was a powerful symbol of hope. But the case was also limited. The Africans won because they could prove they had been recently kidnapped from Africa, not because the court recognized a universal right to freedom. Enslaved people born in America or brought to America years earlier had no such claim. The Amistad decision, while important, did not challenge the fundamental institution of slavery in the United States. The story of the Amistad also reminds us of the courage and agency of enslaved people themselves. Sengbe Pieh and his companions were not rescued by abolitionists. They freed themselves through their own brave action. The rebellion on the ship was their decision, their risk, and their victory. The legal battle that followed was important, but it was secondary to the act of self-liberation that began on that night in July 1839. The Amistad Rebellion stands as one of the most successful slave ship mutinies in history. There were many other rebellions on slave ships during the centuries of the Atlantic slave trade, but most failed. The captives were usually recaptured, killed, or died at sea. The fact that the Amistad captives not only survived but won their freedom through the legal system makes their story extraordinary. In the decades after the Amistad case, the United States moved inexorably toward civil war over slavery. The compromises of the 1820s, 30s, and 40s gradually broke down. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the Dred Scott decision of 1857, and countless other conflicts demonstrated that the nation could not remain half slave and half free. The Amistad case was one episode in this larger story, a moment when the contradictions of American slavery were exposed for all to see. When the Civil War finally came in 1861, and when slavery was finally abolished with the 13th Amendment in 1865, the victory was built on decades of resistance and struggle. Some of that resistance was peaceful legal advocacy like the Amistad case. Some was violent rebellion like Nat Turner's uprising. Some was individual escape like Harriet Tubman and thousands of others who fled to freedom. All of these forms of resistance contributed to the eventual destruction of slavery. The Amistad story has been retold many times in the years since 1839. Books, plays, and films have brought the story to new generations. A replica of the ship now serves as a floating museum and educational vessel. The story continues to resonate because it touches on fundamental questions about freedom, justice, and human rights. Sengbe Pieh's demand for freedom, even when he couldn't speak English, even when he was chained in a foreign land, even when all the power of nations and laws seemed arrayed against him, remains one of history's most powerful assertions of human dignity. His refusal to accept enslavement, his leadership during the rebellion, and his persistence through the legal battle that followed mark him as one of the great freedom fighters of the 19th century. The Amistad case reminds us that justice is not automatic. It has to be fought for in courtrooms and on the decks of ships, in the press, and in the streets. The Africans of the Amistad won their freedom because they were willing to fight for it, because abolitionists were willing to support them, and because, in this one case, the legal system was willing to recognize their humanity. But the case also reminds us of the limits of legal victories when the underlying system of oppression remains intact. The Amistad Africans went free, but millions remained enslaved. It would take a civil war and 600,000 deaths to finally end American slavery. Legal victories are important, but they are not enough when the entire society is built on injustice. Today, when we remember the Amistad Rebellion, we should remember it as part of the larger story of resistance to slavery. We should remember Sengbe Pieh not just as a victim who was rescued, but as a leader who took action, who refused to accept his fate, who demanded justice and ultimately achieved it. We should remember the case as an example of how law can sometimes be used to advance justice, but also of how law can be limited when political and economic interests are at stake. The friendship promised by the ship's name, La Amistad, was never extended to those chained in its hold. But in their rebellion, in their fight for freedom, and in their ultimate victory, the Africans of the Amistad created their own meaning for that name. They formed bonds of solidarity that transcended ethnic and linguistic differences. They supported each other through captivity, rebellion, legal battles, and the long journey home. That fellowship, born in the worst of circumstances, was the true friendship that emerged from the story of the Amistad. This has been Mutiny for Freedom, the Amistad Rebellion. Thank you for listening.